Hello everyone and welcome to the third session on the second and final day of the TRT World Forum 2020. I'm Oscar Sabakti, anchor of TRT World's international business program, Money Talks. I hope you've been enjoying the forum so far. We'll now be taking the discussion further with this next session called Covid-19, an impasse or an opportunity for a sustainable global order. Well, the world continues to be faced with a profound crisis due to the Covid-19 pandemic. This extraordinary situation poses a major challenge for governments and multilateral organisations by deepening inequalities between developing and developed economies, giving a boost to nationalist ideologies and disrupting global supply chains and economic relations. The crisis has exposed the failings and shortcomings of existing local and international institutions in protecting people in the face of both natural and human-made disasters. Although the current crisis is still playing out, it's increasingly clear the pandemic is advancing the call for a reordering of global institutions. But the direction of this transformation remains an open question. This session explores the potential pathways that global economic and political institutions may take in the near future and how policymakers can turn the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity for positive reform. Well, to discuss these issues and more, it's now my pleasure to introduce our panel of esteemed speakers. Gamal Mohamed Hassan is Somalia's Minister of Planning, Investment and Economic Development. Prior to this, he served as the country's ambassador to Kenya. Before joining government, he was a political specialist to the US Special Representative for Somalia. He has also worked for the Government of Canada and Carleton University in Ottawa. And Celso Amorim is Brazil's longest-serving Minister of Foreign Relations and also served as Minister of Defence. A career diplomat, Mr. Amorim remains active in academic life and as a public figure. He was a visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and a distinguished fellow at King's College in 2009. Foreign Policy magazine referred to him as the world's best foreign minister. Karin Kniesel is Austria's former foreign minister. Ms. Kniesel joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1990, serving in Paris and Madrid, as well as the ministry's legal office. In 1998, she left the Foreign Service to work as an analyst. Since then, she has authored several books on geopolitics and the Middle East and has lectured at various top universities. Masamichi Kono is Deputy Secretary General of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. Mr. Kono currently oversees initiatives on infrastructure and sustainable growth and also represents the OECD at the Financial Stability Board. He previously served as a Vice Minister at Japan's Financial Services Agency and was a Committee Secretary at the World Trade Organization. G. John Eikenberry is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Professor Eikenberry also serves as a Global Eminence Scholar at Kyung-hee University in Seoul and is a Fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a former advisor to the State Department and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on US-European relations. And Achim Steiner is the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme. Mr. Steiner is also the Vice Chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group. He previously served as Head of the United Nations Environment Programme, Director General of the UN Office at Nairobi, and Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. A very warm welcome to you all. Mr. Steiner, if I could begin with you first. You have worked for many years in a multilateral environment in the United Nations and many organizations. But historically, when we are faced with crises such as a pandemic or an economic crisis, for that matter, in this case, we're experiencing both, they often lead to reforms, changes, and even a paradigm shift. Is that your view? Might we see a fundamental change in the way the international global order is currently taking place when this pandemic is finally over?
Thank you, Askan. It's a great pleasure and honor to join you in such a distinguished panel. And at a moment like this, you quite rightly pose the question, is there a fundamental change that appears on the horizon, or are we really in a mode of crisis management trying to get back to where we were before? And I think COVID-19 has not yet changed the future. That is quite clear. I think we are in the midst of a terrible and sometimes terrifying struggle of how to balance the containment of a virus with that economic freefall that is happening across the world. And in many ways, what COVID has done is it has revealed a great deal. And I think it is out of that understanding and appreciation of inequality, of vulnerability, of unpreparedness, and also of a relationship between people and the planet, that I think there will be significant shifts towards a different kind of future. And it is difficult to imagine that right now because we are simply in crisis management, and the stimulus packages that you see at the moment only have, let's say, glimpses of what the future may look like in different terms. But just take the issue of climate change and green recovery. Compared to where we were perhaps in December 2019, I think it is fair to assume that we will see greater action on climate change, greater investments in green recovery than we perhaps would have expected in the political reality of 2019. Digitalization is another area that has been fast forwarded significantly. Connectivity, the digital gap, but also closing it, creating entirely new opportunities for development, for addressing poverty, for addressing the economy of the future. These are just two glimpses of possibilities, but I think much of it will depend on how people in countries across the world are engaging with governments to look at different futures. So from the perspective of an economic development paradigm, I believe that there will be very significant changes. And history teaches us that out of deep crisis usually come big transformations. And one example being the United Nations. It celebrates its 75th anniversary. It was born in the midst of the darkest moment of the 20th century. So we do need to look forward. That is why I believe firmly that building forward better will become a guiding motto for, I think, virtually every citizen across the planet. But the risk is that we always go back to where we were before, and that remains a very real risk.
Minister Hassan, if I could turn to you now. Somalia recently benefited from a couple of multilateral institutions, namely the World Bank and IMF, because in March, before the pandemic really took over the world, Somalia was granted some significant debt relief, and Somalia had been calling for that for quite some time. Do you still have faith that multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank still have a role in terms of helping emerging economies such as Somalia's?
Thank you very much, Oscar. Very pleased to be joining this team with panelists. Very good question. You're right, Somalia reached the decision point in the process, the IMF process, the SMP process, which we have been going through for the last few years. We reached a milestone in March, right before, in the middle of, as soon as the pandemic hit globally. This process helped us reform the country, the institutions of the country for the last few years. When we reached that point, which meant that Somalia was able to access grants from the IMF and the World Bank and African Development Bank and other institutions, the global pandemic hit Somalia like the rest of the world, and we're still hopeful that despite these challenges, Somalia will continue to benefit from these multilateral institutions. Definitely, we would see more access, not only for Somalia, but for the developing countries, access to finance. There have been discussions in the recent G20 that took place in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. So the discussions are ongoing, but we're hopeful that despite these challenges, we'll be able to benefit a lot going forward.
Celso Amorim, and as I mentioned, you served, you were officially known as the longest serving foreign minister is in Brazil. I should point out that you served as foreign minister under previous administrations, but I'm wondering, as a Brazilian citizen looking at your current leadership under President Jair Bolsonaro, who really has questioned the validity of some international organisations. He's questioned the way things are currently done in terms of not only in Brazil but around the world. What's your view on Brazil's path right now under Bolsonaro? Do you think we can see Bolsonaro perhaps emulate what Donald Trump has done by pulling out of organisations such as the World Health Organization?
Well, I think in our case, sometimes the bark is stronger than the bite. In any case, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure also with such distinguished colleagues, including an Austrian foreign minister. I studied in the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, so I would like to mention that. Let me just say, we are living under totally abnormal times in Brazil. I mean, I've served different governments. I was foreign minister with a center of left President Lula for 8 years, and with President Dilma for 4 years. And before that, I had been with a more centrist government, and I have been ambassador also with a, well, you would call a center, maybe center right, center left, I am not sure, depends on how you look at it, governments in the past, as ambassador at the UN and WTO and so on. So, and I never felt that I was, let us say, I never felt of violence against my convictions to serve under those governments. They had maybe different leanings. One were more keen more keen on social reform, on a more independent foreign policy, so to say, more South-South cooperation, as the last governments with which I served and to whose party I do belong. So this is my view. But even if I compare with the other governments that I served as ambassador or in which as I served as a career diplomat in the past, never, even during the military dictatorship, Brazil had such an abnormal government, which is a poor imitation of Trumpism. So I only can say that I hope, when Trump was elected, actually I said that the worst thing about Trump, for Latin America at least, is the example. So I hope the fact that he was defeated, not that I have fantastic hopes about Biden, but I hope we're coming to a more normal times, and that will also bring Latin America and Brazil to more normal times. And in more normal times, it means also more attachment to multilateral area, more attachment to Latin American integration, more attachment to the idea of multipolarity as a basis for multilateralism.
Karen Knisel, can I move on to you next? You were foreign minister in Austria and in a centre right-wing government. Previously, you've been critical of leaders such as German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who's seen as a great supporter of multilateral institutions. Do you still have faith that these organisations still have a role, particularly in this pandemic and post-pandemic world?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, also for the invitation, and delighted to be in the same panel as former Minister Celso Amorim. Regarding the role of bilateralism and multilateralism, having been teaching this topic also over the past 2-3 decades, it didn't start yesterday. It has really developed at least over the last 20 years. The eminence of bilateralism. We just have to look at the development inside the World Trade Organization. Ever since 2004, ever since the Doha round talks and their breakdown, bilateralism has been moving on to the detriment of multilateralism. It started with the trade agreements, and it has ended up in all different fora of diplomacy. And the problem with today's craft of diplomacy, I wouldn't even dare to talk about the art of diplomacy, because only a handful of people still master the very old art. But the craft of diplomacy is about seeking for consensus. It's about not polarizing. And we are today, unfortunately, in all sectors of international relations, not only in positions of right or wrong, it's about good and bad. It's a highly polarized world. And in such a climate, it has become very difficult to bridge rifts and to talk to each other. Having been a career diplomat, having stepped out for 20 years and coming back in particular to the European Union way of decision shaping and decision making, I was deeply intrigued and irritated by the fact that we do not anymore use proper tools of diplomacy, which is time, building of trust, and really talking to each other and putting oneself into the position of the other. What we have seen over the last 20 years, unfortunately, is a rise in unilateral position pronunciation. We do not really call each other. We make our unilateral positioning via a press communique, via a tweet, via a post. And the bilateral or the even multilateral decision shaping is losing ground. It has been eroded. And then up to that, you have to bring in the whole financial issue. How many countries are still able to finance the general budget? What is financed over special program budgets? And which countries can then thereby play their interests also to a certain extent? There is a tremendous change going on in the multilateral world. The role of traditional contributors, such as the European Union, such as North American countries, is losing ground to other players. We have other international organizations, big regional organizations, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has been in the shadow for the last 20 years. But I always told students, and I always had a careful eye to what is happening in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this is a place where a lot is going on. And to my analysis, it's not really taken to the extent serious that it should be taken by, for instance, various EU member states. So we see a more regional multilateralism arising. We see a lot of bilateralism, but above that, unilateralism. And each and everyone plays it, in particular also within the European Union.
Yes, Masa Michi Kono, I'd like to bring you into this discussion now because you are Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, an intergovernmental economic organization, which mainly represents nations that are relatively high income countries. It does exclude major economies such as China, for example, which is now the world's second largest economy. It excludes some significant emerging economies such as India, Brazil. So I want to sort of reflect on what Karen Kniesel just said. When organizations like the OECD are seen as an exclusive membership organization, do you believe that after this pandemic, perhaps organizations like yours might reconsider their membership structures and be more inclusive of those other emerging nations, which really are now quite significant economies?
Thank you very much. It's my great honor and pleasure to be here today with you. And before I try to answer your question, just as background, the OECD just published its most recent economic outlook, and in that outlook, actually, we have a few observations and findings to present. And in this context, we do acknowledge that while the pandemic is the first fully global crisis since World War II, international cooperation has been weakened in recent years, and that we must find ways to restore and reinforce international cooperation in all areas, not just healthcare, but all across our economic policies and in terms of development finance and so on. But there are signs of hope. And first, at the OECD, our ministers actually agreed for the first time in 4 years to actually work towards this goal of building back back better and enabling a global, strong, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recovery from COVID-19, and that we should work together in areas, for example, such as science and technology. And in fact, in response to your question, the OECD works much more with our non-members than before, and perhaps it is not well known, but China, India, Brazil, they all come to our committees to join the discussions. We also have joint work programs with many countries, including countries such as Indonesia. Actually, when you were discussing Brazil, actually Brazil is now applying for membership with the OECD, and with China, we continue to engage, and they take part in some of the key committees that we have. So the OECD itself is now trying to develop global standards which will be adopted by a much wider range of countries than our membership. But having said that, of course, our members are key in actually making those standards and policy guidances, recommendations strong, and also, of course, all in the in support of multilateralism. And so, of course, there are bilateral, plurilateral, and regional initiatives, but at the same time, we would really want to call on countries to strengthen our multilateral framework and to build on what we actually have built over the years with a lot of effort, and make this recovery really, as I mentioned, strong, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. Thank you.
Professor Eikenberry, even before this pandemic began, there was one man who really did look to blow up the international order, and that was the outgoing US President Donald Trump. He pulled the US out of, say, the Paris Climate Change Accord. He's pulling the US out of the World Health Organization. He's criticized other UN organizations as well. Of course, Joe Biden will be the next US president, so presumably he will reverse those decisions. But do you believe that such an act from Trump was needed to perhaps shake things up a little and really force these multilateral organizations to, I guess, display their worth, really clarify to the public why these organizations are needed?
First of all, thank you for including me. This is a terrific panel, and in some sense, the most important question of the day is really before us. The answer to your question, I think, is no. I don't think that Trump was necessary. I think that, in fact, he's taken us as a country and as a global system down a very dangerous road. As you just mentioned, the U.S. has, under his watch, pulled out of international institutions, made itself less of a leader in all the different zones of international cooperation, arms control, environment, human rights, economic relations. So I think we have seen, in some sense, an experiment of how the world operates when the most powerful country in the world doesn't tie itself to the global system. And so I do think there will be some lesson drawing that we can take kind of cold comfort from, perhaps, but we will be able to draw some lessons from the Trump administration for how we move forward. I think for the United States, there's a sense that the U.S. over these 4 years has become less influential, less respected, less vital to problem solving. And so I do also think that President-elect Biden knows that. If you say a kind of true believer in the longer term American approach to international relations that we trace back to the dark days of World War II, of building and putting its weight behind building international institutions, seeing its own national interest advance through commitments with other countries, alliances, multilateral institutions, doing well by doing good. And that overall 75-year playbook, I think, is needed more than ever. So I do think we have seen ourselves come off and look over the cliff, and what we see down below is something we want to avoid. And so my fervent hope is that the new administration will redouble an American interest in diplomacy, multilateralism, cooperative security, global problem solving. And if you look finally at the world today beyond the COVID, you see really an emerging geopolitical drama unfolding with the rise of China. And the United States cares a lot about that. There's a lot at stake. It's not just power politics, it's also about values and what kind of international order we want to give to our children and grandchildren. And that struggle, you might say, for the world, for how we build a better world, could be a kind of motivation, as it was in the 1950s and 60s, for competitive race to the top as opposed to racing to the bottom. And so I think while we're at a kind of dark moment, like other dark moments in world history, there is a kind of silver lining that we should search for and try to encourage.
Mr. Steiner, the UN development program which you head wasn't in Donald Trump's line of fire, but most other UN organizations were, including the World Trade Organization, various climate change initiatives that fall under the UN's purview, as well as the World Health Organization. I'm curious, as someone who has close contacts with people in those organizations, was there a genuine fear among people within the UN organization as a whole about the threat that Donald Trump posed to not only the UN, but also multilateralism in general?
Well, Oscar, I think as my fellow panelists have already alluded to, multilateralism is a constantly evolving organism. And I think the reality is that we lived through many periods. Remember the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, there are periods in which polarization, different views, the willingness or unwillingness of nations to work together through the United Nations platform have been with us before. And while President Trump was a particular voice, I think it is more the concern that a real world power of the significance and magnitude of the United States would continue to withdraw from the United Nations. At the end of the day, the effectiveness of the United Nations is principally determined by the willingness of countries to use that instrument, to be committed to it, because it ultimately makes sense to them. And I think clearly for us, beginning with the Secretary General, when he took up his office, the first priority was not to let the politics of the day essentially weaken a fundamental and 75-year-long relationship with the United States. That is not a singular relationship, but it is a critical part of the way that, first of all, in global security policy, the Security Council either is able to operate or not operate. And I think what you have seen, because of a very polarized view within the United States that expresses itself across many different arenas, and the UN fora and platforms and mechanisms were only one segment, I think, of the current administration's view of taking the US out of these arenas. I think we have actually been able to maintain a very constructive relationship with the United States. And I think in the new administration, you see that pendulum swinging back. And I think what is quite clear and what this period has taught us is that the United Nations is vital for the smallest nations because they have a seat in that General Assembly Hall. They have a voice. They're often overlooked, small island states, poorer countries. That is one vital function. At the same time, the superpowers must believe in the value of the United Nations. And as my fellow panelists have said, there are flaws, but I think the idea of the United Nations inherently remains even more relevant, and that is why you see a new administration returning into the international arena, and hopefully also with new impulses to evolve the instruments, the institutions, and the agendas for cooperation. Cybercrime, climate change, pandemics, extremism. I mean, you could go on. If ever there was an age where we needed an institution, not singularly, because cooperation happens at many levels, regional, bilateral, but ultimately the challenges we face right now are fundamentally dependent on collective action. And that is why I believe the incoming administration will provide a very positive impulse, and we will see a number of critical steps to bring the multilateral agendas up to date and into a modus operandi that allows the world to find more common ground than that which divides it. And that has always been the assumption underlying these institutions. There will be failures along the way. We will have elections. There will be extreme positions. Celso Amorim spoke about the current administration in Brazil. But that's why I want to remind people 75 years is quite a long time. And this ingenious construct of an international body where every nation is heard and represented, I think remains even more important today than perhaps after the Second World War.
Minister Hassan, you're a leader in Somalia, which is considered a low-income emerging economy. Do you believe that countries like yours do have a voice on the world stage? Mr. Steiner mentioned that every country is treated equally in forums such as the UN General Assembly, but in almost every other organisation out there, countries like Somalia don't have a seat at the table. Do you think a change is long overdue, that countries like Somalia should be recognised more in an official capacity and have membership to other international and multilateral organisations?
Thank you very much. I think the call for reform in the international institutions has been reverberating across the global, the developing world. Having said that, there's no substitute for the multilateralism to unilateralism. We have seen what's happening now in many parts of the world, the populism and the change of critical policies, the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Club, from the climate change conference. What's really undeniable and that the pandemic has exposed now is the fact that these multinational institutions will only be or will be more responsive to the needs of the low-income countries when more of their top management and the decision makers are more intimate understanding of the situations on the ground. Having, as a Somali, come from Somalia, I think we can see that here on the ground in Somalia. We have very strong relationship with the UN and many other institutions, but sometimes it takes a while to have the real impact of these institutions on the people when a crisis like this pandemic or a poverty or a famine or a drought or issues like the climate change related issues take place. So it's really important to consider the voice of the developing world when making these tough decisions. When it comes to Security Council, calls for reforms have been happening. African countries and many other developing countries have voiced their concerns with the setup and the structure of the Security Council and many other institutions. Case in point is the last WTO, the DG position of the WTO. We know there was an issue there when the final candidate that won the nomination was a former Nigerian Minister of Finance, and we had some countries trying to block that. So a real change is needed now in those multinational organizations, but that cannot be substituted for unilateralism and countries going bilaterally. We need the system, but we need to reform it.
Celso Amorim, we know Jair Bolsonaro has been described as the Trump of the tropics, and it certainly seems that Bolsonaro has emulated many of Trump's actions. For example, he's opened up the Amazon rainforest to development. He really denied the threat of the pandemic for a very long time, even after he contracted COVID-19 himself. Do you believe that this crisis really exposed the fact that multinational institutions are only as powerful as their member states, that all it takes is for a populist leader like Bolsonaro to come along and rip up various agreements and undermine these organizations, and there's very little that these international organizations can do to counter that?
Well, thank you. I would hope we'd leave Jair Bolsonaro for a moment. I'm all the time trying to forget about him, so you bring him back. I'll just mention to you that Jair Bolsonaro doesn't appear like that. I mean, it's not. It's caused by several factors. It would be too long for me to go on that. Would have to do with internal changes, of course, but it have to do also with some international situations. But I don't want to go into that because that would be too. I want to stress, as others did, the value of multilateralism. But I want also to underline that there is a confusion. For me, OECD is not multilateralism. It's okay that it exists. It's okay that its members can discuss several things. I was there for many times. As you mentioned, Brazil has a kind of special relationship. I hope Brazil doesn't become a member, by the way. I mean, so I hope the OECD, the bureaucracy of OECD is slow enough so that we have a change in government in Brazil and Brazil doesn't need to become a member. No other BRICS country is a member of the OECD, and for good reasons. But I don't want to go into that. But OECD is not multilateralism. NATO is not multilateralism. It may be useful. I'm not discussing that. Multilateralism for me is the UN and the really multilateral bodies. And they, especially the UN, is in need of very important reform. We need to reform the Security Council. I mean, we can't have the most powerful body in the world, the only one that has decisions that have to be complied with, paralyzed in the case of the pandemics because of the veto power. I know it sounds a bit utopian. I was ambassador to the UN for 4 years and discussing reform. I know it's not a simple thing, Mr. Stein. I know it's not a simple thing, but we have to look. I mean, you have to be a bit utopian in order to make change happen. And I think we need to change the Security Council. We need to have a body more or less along the lines of the G20, maybe with some improvement, more African presence, less European presence in a way, and so that it can be more representative, which also can help in questions like climate change, in questions like global health. It can't go everything to the Security Council, because in the Security Council, everything is seen under the light of peace and security. And so I think all these changes are necessary. I'm not just mentioning them. So I think an important thing that we should do, maybe we need a new process, a San Francisco process, to discuss deeply all the bodies of the United Nations, not just perfunctory reform here and there to make better the administration here and there. I think it's a deep reform. Well, it will take time, but you'll have to take into account, I agree with Professor Eikenberry, it's very important that the United States, the still most powerful country in the world, goes back to multilateral system. That's very important. But we cannot deny, as he doesn't actually, that China it's a new factor. So in a way, it's a new world. It's a different form of organization of life with bad things and good things. I'm not sure. It's not for me to judge. But in any case, these are things that cannot be left aside. And so I still hope that we can, in the case of Brazil, I think we have to do much more for regional integration, for Latin America integration, so that Europe also is very important in a more multipolar world. So all these things, all these factors, Africa, of course, which is the fastest growing continent in the world, if you make the exception of China. So all these things together, have to build a different world. We cannot find that we had a world system that was created 75 years and which showed a lot of resilience, which helped avoiding maybe worse situations than we find. But it also has shown that in many cases it is powerless. So what we need, it's not international organizations to substitute for governments. Governments will continue to work on that, but we need a really multilateral system, which more fair, which is more reflection of the present world. And the present world after the pandemic will be very different from the world before the pandemic, with the crisis in globalization, the crisis in neoliberalism, with many other questions, the crisis of populism also, maybe the rebirth of democracy, and all that has to reflect in a world body. I'm sorry, too long, maybe, sorry.
Okay. Karen Kniesel, I want to talk about the European Union now, because I think this pandemic really exposed some of the weaknesses that the EU has. Indeed, some of the strongest criticisms came from its own members, namely countries like Italy and Spain, which were the hardest hit by this pandemic. It took EU leaders many months before they agreed on any sort of financial help aimed at countries that were hardest hit, including Italy and Spain. But these countries won't see €1 of these funds that were committed until next year, so more than a year after the pandemic really took hold. So do you believe that the EU, when this pandemic is over, will be forced to self-reflect and perhaps change to cater for those who do need help the most in a timely manner? Are we going to see a paradigm shift within the EU after all this?
Thank you very much for this very pertinent question. You mentioned the reconstruction fund money that was decided theoretically in mid-July in a very long, cumbersome summit. But the big question mark is still what will happen next Tuesday, Wednesday, because we have 2 member states of the European Union having put so far a veto to the entire budget, not just to the reconstruction fund. So everything is right now in total limbo. And there is no plan B if the veto is upheld by these 2 member states. So there's really a huge question mark over hanging over the European Union right now on all levels. We had in the first wave of the pandemic, the countries you mentioned, Spain and Italy, very much hit. Right now, we can see that countries like the Czech Republic is tremendously hit, very high toll of people who were killed. So the second wave is not yet taken into account for this contingency planning, the financial contingency planning. So this is only the money question, which is a very important one. But beyond that, we have, of course, the issue of how to coordinate very basic topics, such as what kind of travel restrictions are taken along which kind of parameters. And here, unfortunately, each and every EU member state handles its priorities in a different way. In summer, it was the summer tourism. Right now, it's the winter tourism. It might sound banal, but unfortunately, it catches the agenda. The Austrian government was warning against traveling to the neighboring countries to the Mediterranean. And right now, the Austrians would like to have a winter tourism season taking place, while the rest of the European Union countries is very, very prudent, and for good reasons, very prudent to have winter tourism. So in the middle of tremendous unemployment, social unrest, we are discussing tourism. Which I think is it gives a strange flavor to the whole topic. Even so, of course, I'm very much aware of the economic role of tourism. No doubt about that. But the fundamental issue for the European Union now, apart from solving the very important issue of can we pass a budget next week, is how to run such force majeure, which in the end is not really force majeure, because when you go to the various imminent threats to global security, whether it was the Davos Forum that has been discussing it or other international organizations, pandemic was always among the top issues next to climate change, next to global inequality, income gap, etc. These are the 3 main threats to global security. So we could have been aware of it. And I would say after 7 months when the whole thing started, unfortunately, the lessons learned are not yet applied. Now, what could that mean for the way EU decision shaping and EU decision making is happening? I think there is a sense of there's a rising sense of alienation between the political class and citizens. This is definitely felt.
Okay, Masamichi Kono, Professor Eikenberry raised the issue of China earlier, the fact that it was really emerging as a disruptor of the international order. Let's look at China for a moment. We know it was the world's first coronavirus epicenter, but it did manage to handle that outbreak relatively well. It's now handling its economic recovery relatively well as well. We're seeing indicators coming out of China that economic growth is happening that I guess most nations would really only envy right now. Given the fact that China economically appears to be really threatening or at least rising to the point that America is at right now, do you believe that at some point organizations like the OECD will need to consider having China at the table instead of China joining other, I guess, rival organizations? Is it worth having a country like China in an organization like yours?
Thank you. Well, the short answer, of course, is yes. And actually, I should have mentioned this in my first intervention that China, Brazil, and other G20 non-OECD members are already our key partners. And by key partner, by being a key partner, those countries get invited to our committees. They also have, in many areas, MOUs to work together with the OECD. And all this is really on the recognition that global issues do need global solutions. And the OECD doesn't claim to be the center of multilateralism. No, it's actually, in many areas, we support the UN to develop new standards. And for example, concerning the Paris Accord, we want to be what can be called the best supporting actor, in the sense that we can provide data, evidence-based analysis, and sound policy recommendations that can be agreed on in a bipartisan manner. And so, in a way, in many areas, actually, China and Brazil are already working constructively with us. One example is in digital taxation, where we are now negotiating a global agreement on how to tax digital companies and digital services. In this arena, 137 countries take a part, and particularly India has been playing a very constructive role in this forum. So, and this is called the Inclusive Forum, by the way. And so, what I would certainly like to suggest is that if you can't have a almighty global institution top down, I think there's a way of working bottom up that is on each subject. There are places where good work has already been done. In our case, we have, for example, the Anti-Bribery Convention, and we want G20, all G20 countries to be members of that convention. And this was recognized by the G20 because, of course, we work together very closely with the G20 and the G7. So that certainly in that respect, China, we will continue engaging with China, while of course not diluting our standards, but we would like China to join as much as possible our standards and be part of the global system. And for that matter, actually, China has really been promulgating their support for a multilateral trading system, a multilateral rules-based trading system. And of course, it's easier said than done, of course, but we want to help China live up to that commitment. Thank you.
Professor Eikenberry, can we continue this discussion on China, which you talked about earlier as well? Because China, on the one hand, has been praised for how it's managed to lift millions of its own people out of poverty through its economic development. But on the other hand, it's been criticized for its values as well. It's not a democracy. Its human rights record has been questioned. When we look at the way it's trying to impose its values on Hong Kong at the moment, that's really sparked protests from leaders around the world as well. But in the wake of how it's handled the outbreak, how it's handled its economic recovery, do you believe that the perception of China will change after this pandemic? Might countries like the US, the UK, even Australia, which have been really resisting China's rise, might they be more open-minded to perhaps including China in the way decisions are made around the world?
Well, that's a great question. And let me just say that as we discuss China and the reform of the global system, we should keep in mind that there are, in some sense, three global challenges that are simultaneously putting themselves in front of us. One is the shift in the global balance of power, which is really the story of the rise of China, but more generally of Asia, the relative decline of the West. And we're trying to sort through that. We're trying to struggle over how to redistribute authority and votes in international institutions, perhaps reform the UN Security Council. The last time that was attempted was in 2005 with the high-level report. It didn't work so well, but this crisis of power transition is creating struggles over authority, but also over values. China is rising, but also putting before the international system illiberal, authoritarian, and drifting towards more kind of neo-totalitarian kinds of domestic political values. So there's a challenge there. The second global crisis is the crisis of modernity. We've entered the Anthropocene era. This is global warming. This is the pandemic. This is the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And this is a global problem that will require global solutions. It will require a stronger United Nations, more multilateralism, and it will require China and the United States as the two largest countries. They emits 27% of carbon into the atmosphere. The US emits 15% of the global total. That's 42%. The US and China have to work together on global warming. And I think there's an opening that the Biden administration can help trigger. The U.S. is going to return to the Paris Agreement on January 20th. So there's a real opportunity there. So there's the power crisis, there's the modernity crisis, but there's also a crisis of liberal democracy. The liberal democracies who have been at the center of the international order for 100 years are not doing so well. And this is not a problem that relates to China. It's a problem of how we build and rebuild our liberal democratic societies. And this is where I think there's a role for the democracies, the G7, and what some people are calling the D10, which includes India and Australia. South Korea is very important. So a subset of the international order that want to preserve and advance values that China doesn't stand for. And so that's a struggle that will involve efforts that China's not in, and that will make the relationship with China more complex. So we've got to be able to envisage a future where it's going to be both competition and cooperation. It's going to be global, but it's also going to be sub-global. And that's just the world we're just going to have to evolve into, I think.
Okay, Mr. Steiner, I want to talk about one of the points that Professor Eikenberry raised, and that's the reform of not only the Security Council, but also the United Nations as a whole. UN reform is a perennial topic of discussion among members who aren't part of the Permanent Five. Indeed, countries like Turkey, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has repeatedly said that the world is bigger than the Permanent Five members of the Security Council, which seem to hold all the power in that decision-making forum. As a leader in the United Nations system itself, do you recognise those calls to reform elements of the United Nations, including the Security Council? And do you also recognise the fact that when countries like Saudi Arabia, which has a questionable human rights record, finds itself on the Human Rights Council, that perhaps the UN is exposed to descriptions of hypocrisy itself and therefore really does need a root and branch reform?
Thank you, Oscar. And let me make it very clear. I consider myself part of a generation of UN leaders who joined the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, precisely because we recognize, we embrace this notion that the UN has to evolve. Now, reform is often reduced to bureaucratic and administrative and organizational reforms. And I want to, first of all, simply say to anybody who is listening today, I am amongst those who would absolutely recognize the limitations, the deficiencies, the challenges we have. We are not machines. We are organizations composed of people governed by member states who often have very contrarian views. It's a complex field in which to operate, but it's never an excuse not to rethink, revisit, and evolve the model. And I think all of us on the panel recognize that whether you call for another San Francisco moment, whether we call for reform of the Security Council, the United Nations will only continue to be a dynamic and attractive proposition to the world in the 21st century if it can evolve with the way that the world is evolving. And I think whether you singularize it down to the emergence of major new players, China, the emerging economies, shifts in geopolitical symmetries, I think there is no question that the UN must evolve. Now, the challenge we have is that it is only the member states who can actually do the real reforms, the real leaps forward. The Security Council reform proposition has been, as Seltsamarim knows better than anyone, on the books for more than 25 years. It is obviously the challenge that those who currently hold the veto do not see a way forward that does not diminish their role. And so we must come to a moment where countries recognize that the value of a reformed and evolved United Nations reflecting the state of our world becomes so critical that there is a degree of trade-off that becomes feasible. It's very difficult to do that when you have an extremely agitated and polarized G2 world, so to speak. I think we are moving to new territory. I think we need to learn to recognize China as a new superpower. That is challenging to many countries across the world. On the other hand, the world has been asking China to step up as a major economic power, to contribute financially with peacekeeping troops and others to the capacity of the world to act. So that's one side. But let me also be clear. What we saw in the first 10 months of this year was very sobering. The inability of the Security Council to convene and agree, of the General Assembly to come together, the political organs of the United Nations have been struggling because of the deep divisions that some countries have essentially brought into the fora of multilateral and collective ability to act. But let me also say, and I do this with deep conviction, the operational side of the UN, often not seen so clearly, not perceived to be so central, whether it is UNICEF, the World Food Programme, UNDP, UNAIDS, UNFPA, the World Health Organization. We were the backbone of a global community in freefall, in extreme distress, and with many countries basically not even having the basic means to protect themselves. We set up air bridges. Our staff continued to work. We are part of stabilizing, helping countries to manage the crisis, keeping governments open, and now also providing a vaccine platform that simply doesn't determine whether you have access to it because you're rich. That is the United Nations at work also in the year 2020, and that operational side of the UN is as vital, if sometimes not more real, as my colleague Minister Hassan will confirm, in all its imperfections, to countries who look to the international community to get through these crises. That is part of the promise of solidarity and of multilateralism. And so the reform of the UN has to happen in the political arena. For that, we need a new political consensus. We also have to evolve the machinery of the United Nations. But I think precisely in the midst of this extraordinary crisis, simultaneously affecting over 190 nations, the UN was there. It didn't leave, it didn't close down, and it kept going. And that is part of the promise of multilateralism that we also need to protect by evolving it.
Okay, Achim Steiner, thank you so much for your contribution. We understand you do have to leave our discussion early, but we do thank you for joining us up until now. So thank you very much, and good luck with your work at the UNDP. Now, Minister Hassan, can I bring this discussion back to you now? Mr. Steiner did mention the issue of a coronavirus vaccine. Indeed, today the United Kingdom announced that it had approved one of those vaccines, the Pfizer candidate, which could be rolled out in the UK as early as next week. I'm wondering, do you believe that this issue of coronavirus vaccines will really test the mettle of these multilateral organisations such as the World Health Organization to ensure that countries like Somalia that don't have the buying power of the United States and the US and the EU, do you think these organisations will be tested in terms of ensuring that these vaccines are distributed fairly around the world, including into countries like Somalia?
Absolutely. I think that will be the biggest test case for the multilateral institutions, case in point, the WHO. I think what will happen and what we really need to see happening is to create some sort of platform where African countries, all the developing countries, can access the vaccines on time without any delay, because we have the pandemic is global. It doesn't discriminate. We have some of the most vulnerable communities in our countries. Lots of people that their lives have been impacted. They're completely dependent on very meager social safety nets. So we need to make sure that the vaccines reach those who need the most. And how do we do that? I think that's the challenge. I think we need to make sure that the UN system works for all of us. The multilateral institutions work for all of us. The reason we've been calling for reform is precisely because issues like this can happen any minute. And when this happens, the issue will be who can afford to survive. So that's why we need to have the voices of the developing countries at the table. And when we're making these kind of decisions, people should be there. All of us should be there. I believe the UN and the international community will make the proper decisions when deciding who gets the vaccine. We understand some of the countries have already introduced it and approved the Pfizer and biotech vaccines, like the UK. We're looking forward to the rest of the world to expedite the process of approving these vaccines so we can get them as early as possible. Definitely, I believe things will change, but we would like to see the reforms taking place simultaneously as we face these challenges together.
Now, Mr. Amorim, you have been critical of several international organizations. You mentioned earlier that your hope is that Brazil doesn't join the OECD. But do you believe that this COVID-19 pandemic will be a good reason to change things up in terms of the international order? Or will it be business as usual once vaccines are rolled out and this pandemic is quickly forgotten about?
Well, I'm not an epidemiologist myself, but from what I hear, the pandemic will not be a passing phenomenon. Even the vaccines, of course, we have a lot of hope on the vaccines. There are several being tested. They should not be politicized. We should work with all of them in a technical and scientific way, which is not being done in Brazil, by the way, by a populist right-wing government. So we have to look from this point of view. We have to ensure that they are available accessibly to all countries, including poor countries. And I think Brazil worked a lot for that in the past when it held, for instance, just to mention something that everyone knows here, certainly Mr. Steiner knows, which is the famous flexibilities of the TRIPS agreement, in order that the poor countries can also have, if necessary, compulsory license, but if not, at least cooperation to have in an accessible way. No, I think it's not a passing phenomenon. I think it's a very important phenomenon. I think it's a big change in the world. And I think it comes, as mentioned before here, coupled with other phenomena. I think it comes coupled with the rise of China, Whether it's good or bad, it's another matter, but I think it's better to have more plural. But anyway, you have the rise of China. You have an attempt, despite all the difficulties, of having a more united Europe with fiscal policies also. I mean, at least the reconstruction fund, we know all the difficulties, but anyway, this isn't something new. The novelty about the new Marshall Plan is that it will be a Merkel plan or it will be a Xi Jinping plan. It will not be a Biden plan. That's something we know for sure. So the world is changing in a very important and structural way. In Latin America, for instance, the big protests against the excesses of globalization and new liberalism in Chile started before the pandemic. But all these things now come together, and the pandemic is a big catalyzer. And we have, I mean, I don't like this question of opportunities because the pandemic is bad. So it's bad, and we have to deal with something that is bad. But having said that, we have to use this moment in order to try to make the world more able to respond to big global changes. And I don't want to go much further, but let me say two things. First, when one speaks of democracy, you have to think of democracy taking into account, it's not expanding what we have in the United States. The United States has produced Trump, has produced Guantanamo, has produced many things that are not totally democratic, have produced reactions in relation to immigrants, which are totally against human rights also. So I'm not against the United States. I actually have great admiration for the affirmative action that the United States have produced, the role of women, the advance of black population in spite of all the problems. So I have great admiration for the US democracy, but I can see the flaws also. So I think you have to have an inclusive world in which all the countries can bring their contribution from Africa, from Latin America, from Europe, based on their experience. And that's what I see as an important thing to happen in the future. And I think the pandemic, if you wish, I don't like the word opportunity for good reasons, but if it is an occasion in which we have to discuss all these things in a global way, with a broad-minded way, I think that's necessary. That's what I think it's necessary. I would have one word about democracy, but I want democracy and corruption, but that would take too long. I'll just mention one word, and if you wish, I can elaborate on that. It's a word that Pope Francis has been using very much, which is lawfare. So I'm very skeptical also of how the fight against corruption can be used to topple progressive governments.
Okay, now Karen Kniesel, can I bring you in again? We spoke about the challenges that the EU faced in helping those countries hardest hit like Italy and Spain, but even before the pandemic, we saw the advent of Brexit, which was a direct challenge to what the EU really stands for. We have leaders in countries like Hungary, Viktor Orban, who's also challenged the concept of the EU. Do you believe that after this pandemic, under Ursula von der Leyen's leadership, will the EU take those criticisms on board and really look to genuinely self-reflect and perhaps reform how things are done in Brussels?
It's the issue of the day, of the next decade, and the self-questioning, the self-reflection by member states of the European Union is something that should have started at the latest in June 2016, when the Brexit referendum resulted in the no vote, in the leave vote, as you just mentioned. But instead of really taking up that issue and reflecting on what went wrong, why was there this vote, not just doing an analysis that was a pure domestic British discussion. No, it should have happened also in some sort of self-criticism by the others. But instead of doing that, what happened in summer 2016, 4 years ago, was the following. It was more a kind of, well, the way we will now handle the whole technical performance should be done in such a way that no other EU member states would be tempted to take the British example. So as a minister, I followed Brexit fairly closely, and I was always skeptical whether there will be an agreement, even so the draft agreement negotiated by Commissioner Michel Barnier was a very, very elaborate one, but the entire way of handling it with the various prime ministers was not the best one. It could have been done in a different way. So I would say in a conclusive note, no, we did not learn anything from the 2016 situation. And 4 years later, the overall atmosphere is even more difficult. I mean, Brexit now appears like a footnote against the backdrop of the long list of problems that we have right now. Budget is one. How to deal with member states such as Hungary, the internal debate in Hungary and Poland, there is a tremendous rift. And so I think debates should have happened much more earlier, at the latest 2016, and they were not done. Mr. Chairman, if you permit me one small word on vaccination, because I listened carefully to what our colleague from Somalia has stated. Vaccination rates are very, very dense and highly respected in countries like Bangladesh or Rwanda and many other sub-Saharan African countries. Why? Because people are aware of the misery an infection can bring along. And vaccination rates are very low inside EU countries. The lowest rates you have in Germany, in Austria. Take the regular influenza vaccination. Only 6% of Austrians take this vaccination. About 60% do it in France because it's there's been a rise in also certain government obligations. But when I come back to the German-speaking world by and large, and also reflecting on some Scandinavian EU member states, it's not only about alternative energy in our countries, it's also about alternative medicine. There's a very strong criticism of conventional medicine. And talking about vaccination, it's very conventional medicine, if I may say, but it's a very effective one. And there's a tremendous hope now linked to vaccination. But there's also at the same time a very strong debate, a very strong rejection of any kind of government-prescribed vaccination. So this is still a debate to go on. I personally have still my World Health Organization passport from 1970. Ever since I was a small child, we were traveling a lot. I know about infection. I've always been vaccinated. I've never been a critic of vaccination. But I know about the strong degree of criticism that we have, in particular in the German-speaking world. And interestingly enough, the higher education rate that you have, the more critical people are of conventional medicine, such as vaccination. So this is still something to bear in mind, and we will see. I've been reflecting on that in my recent book on mobility. Will the vaccination passport become more important than the regular passport? I worked in Angola a few years ago, and I observed with interest that at the border control, my vaccination passport was checked first before my passport. And that I saw with interest 5-6 years ago when I traveled to Luanda. And this is a development that could move to other countries. Mobility linked to your vaccination passport. And there, I think we will still see a very strong debate in the German-speaking world along the lines of this rejection of conventional medicine.
Mr. Konok, can I continue on that thread of a potential coronavirus vaccine? The OECD's economic outlooks are highly regarded, highly influential. I've been following every one of them myself, and each of them released during the crisis has changed depending on when the OECD thinks normal economic activity can resume during and after the pandemic. How closely linked is the rollout of a safe and effective vaccine to the resumption of normal economic activity in any given country and indeed around the world?
Thank you, and thank you for your interest in the economic outlook. Now, our overall observation in this latest economic outlook is that it is, for the first time actually since we entered this crisis, that the outlook is looking brighter with vaccines in sight, and there is strong and continuous policy support for its development and also for its distribution. And I'm now looking at the leaders' declaration of the G20 that was published in October, and it is clearly stated here that we will spare no efforts to ensure the vaccines affordable and equitable access for all people. And we have to mean this. I mean, having an agreement is of course important, but at the same time, we really have to make this happen. And if actually we make our maximum efforts, over the course of next year, we do think that there will be a significant change in the economic prospects, and that we already project as a central projection an average growth rate of 4% over next year and the following year, that is 2021 to 22. But this is very much based on, of course, the plausible, I would say, assumption that we will have those vaccines deployed, and that this will be globally available and affordable, accessible. And if this doesn't happen, of course, it doesn't work, because it is very clear that this is not only a global crisis. If we don't eradicate this virus from all corners of the world, we will never have a really functioning global economy. And of course, we are so interconnected that there is no other option. So, but then I would like to add that I spent most of my past career fighting financial crises, the Japanese banking crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis. And of course, every time we make mistakes, there are so many tensions, there are deaths, there are tragedies. But in the end, we somehow found ways to work together and collaborate. And even after the great financial crisis, actually, I found that governments had closer communication than before the crisis, and of course a closer collaboration also. So this time, certainly we have to make that happen, and of course that's a challenge, but I want to be really working on that, and we are all committed. And as Akim Steiner mentioned, it's not just UN, but all international organizations rallied together to work towards that, and we haven't closed shop despite all the difficulties of mobility, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Eikenberry, can I continue that discussion about a vaccine? Because really it is seen as something that will restore some level of normalcy during this pandemic. We know that the World Health Organization has developed their so-called COVAX initiative, which aims to distribute any successful vaccines to poorer countries who perhaps can't afford to be spending billions in buying up potential vaccines now, as we're seeing countries like the US, the UK, the EU, Australia do at this moment. But are you worried that in effect, though, we will see this world where it will be split into two, those who can afford to have a vaccine and those who can't, the have and have-nots of a coronavirus vaccine? And what will that do in terms of the reputation of organizations like the World Health Organization?
A very important worry. I do worry about the we'll call it the geopolitics of the vaccine and the scramble for a national control, the rich countries looking after their own first, the exacerbation of long-standing divisions and inequalities and hierarchies in the international order. And I do think there's an opportunity to use the more enlightened ideas that I think the WHO stands for, the inclusive, expansive provision of the vaccine as a way of signaling and reinforcing a kind of new era understanding of where we are, that we're all in it together. And I think that's, as this panel comes to an end, I do think that 2020 will stand out. 100 years from now, I think historians will look back and say 2020, that was one of the big years, not necessarily for good reasons, but I do think that the possibility is that we will have revealed to ourselves as human beings that we are all in it together, that there's a fragile and fraught common existence, that require competent government, that there are costs to failed international cooperation, that there's a fragility to democratic governments, and that our, we'll call it Enlightenment values about openness, rule of law, freedom of information, accountable government, all values we care about are very fragile, and that ultimately there's an inescapability to our common existence as people working together, and that in the end, the last age of multilateralism, the great explosion of multilateralism after World War II, came from a very simple insight that we're only as safe as the weakest among us. At the Bretton Woods in 1944, the argument that FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, made was that we are in an era of interdependence where we are at the mercy of the contagion of bad economic ideas. And so too, 75, 80 years later, we are only as strong as our weakest link. The healthcare and public health capacities of our weakest and most vulnerable society we're implicated in their success. And so I think that's the message that I hope 2020 will stand for, that you can't be secure alone, you can only be secure together.
Now, Minister Hassan, at a time when organisations like the WTO, international trade were being undermined by the Trump administration, it was interesting to look at the African continent because 28 countries have managed to sign the African Continental Free Trade Area, of which Somalia is a member. And I guess it goes back to Karen Kniesel's point about regional multilateralism in the absence of more broader cooperation. How important is a free trade agreement in Africa in terms of helping Somalia really boost its economy at a time when the pandemic has hit not only its economy, but economies around the world?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. As you know, most of the top performing economies in the world were in Africa before the pandemic hit. Although the loss of human lives were not as severe as many parts of the world, but the socio-economic impact can be felt and seen clearly across Africa. And that had an impact on the trading activities in Africa. Having said that, we have, as you rightly mentioned, the inter-African free trade agreement that most of the African countries now, I think, have signed and deposited the ratification instruments with the African Union. We are not, we're looking at trading amongst each other, but we're not doing it at the expense of the global trade. For instance, in my country, we are located in the Horn of Africa, linking the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden to the Indian Ocean. And you know, that area, the maritime trade that takes place in that area is huge globally. And we position ourselves to take advantage of that, not as a Somalia only, but as an African country. And this trade agreement is giving us that access. Locally and regionally, we are seeing countries creating blocks. For instance, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and other countries are creating this Horn of Africa integration agreement, which means economically we have to be able to work closely and remove all these trade barriers, make sure that we have access to each other. On the other hand, not that far from us, the East Africa, we have the East African community, and we have SADC, we have the ECOWAS, we have COMESA, which brings us together. So there are many different regional organizations that we use to trade with each other. But this pandemic, 2020, taught us that unless we come together globally, unless we come together and reform the institutions that we all belong to, it would be very difficult to do things silos. Whether it doesn't matter whether you're a very rich country or a very poor country, we are in the same boat. And these organizations that we created are instruments to enhance the global partnership, to enhance the multilateralism. So we're looking at, we see the opportunity, but also need to be mindful of the real work that needs to be done after 2020.
Now, Mr. Amorim, you touched on the BRICS organizations, which include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In the wake of this pandemic, what role will emerging powers have in the international order of things? Do you think they'll emerge stronger and more influential when this pandemic is over?
Yes, I do think so. I think BRICS had already an important role in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008. It was fundamental to have, for the first time, not enough, but a significant change in the quota system in the IMF. So in a way, it improved the distribution of power to some extent in the economic institutions. And I think it will go the same way. I agree that there are different values. The countries don't have all the same kind of organizations. But I think it is important for the multipolar world we want to live in. We don't want a hegemony from any country. I don't want a world that is under United States hegemony, but I don't want a world which is under Chinese hegemony either. I want a world which is balanced, in which Africa, Latin America, Europe, all of us can also have our say and influence in the world. And I think this is as far as we can go in terms of democracy in the international system. We cannot hope that we'll have an international system, something that we are still grappling with in internal governments. But anyway, I think BRICS is important. It represents an enormous, I don't have all the percentages here, but it's like 40% of the world population, 25% of the world territory, 20% or so of the world GDP. So it's of course very important, and it includes countries from all regions. It is very important the presence of South Africa there, because it's not only the voice of South Africa as such, but it's the voice of Africa that to some extent is supposed to be heard through South Africa. So I think it's very important, and it's part of the world in which the globalization, which of course is in crisis, but it's an inevitable tendency, becomes more fair, more equitable, and more balanced. So I put my bets there.
Okay, Karen Knisel, can I ask you a similar question about the European Union? You mentioned earlier that you believe the EU really missed an opportunity in the wake of Brexit to perhaps self-reflect and change some of its ways. But do you believe that after this pandemic, will the EU emerge weaker or stronger?
It will be very different, and my gut feeling is that it will be different. I cannot yet tell what is weaker or stronger, because what would it mean to have a stronger European Union? It would have, according to President Ursula von der Leyen, a geopolitical European Union, one that is not sandwiched between China, Russia, the United States, etc., but one that would be able to act out of its own interests. And so far, we have not been yet able to formulate interests. We focus around values, but an interest-based foreign policy, an interest-based foreign trade policy has not yet emerged, whether it's in the automotive sector, whether it's in energy, etc. So it will be different, but I don't see it on the way of becoming that what President von der Leyen has pronounced for her commission, namely a geopolitical European Union, a power by its own. That I don't see in the making. So to respond to your question, I would have to end on that.
Remains to be seen. Okay, Karin Kniesel, and you will have the last word in this discussion because it does bring us to the end of our panel. Thank you all to our guests, Minister Gamal Mohamed Hassan, Celso Amorim, Karin Kniesel, Achim Steiner, Masamichi Kono, and Professor John G. Eikenberry. And thank you to you all who have tuned into this session. I hope you found it as interesting and informative as I did. But do stay tuned to the TRT World Forum 2020 because coming up we have Elif Bereketli who will present a reflections discussion on the future of the film industry.